Gutenberg's Prince, and Machiavelli's Royal Sense. I am, as always, your host, Christopher Paul Dugdale, MEDMA. We are Duncanville High School in these United States, and today is September 24th, 2020. And on this date in history, 1908, the first Model T was created. Also, this is my wife's half birthday. So if you see her, make sure you sing happy birthday to you.
Okay, let's talk about Francesco Petrarch. He's the father of humanism. Now, what he does is he finds some forgotten Latin manuscripts and translates them into a modern Latin, uh, so that some of his contemporaries that understood Latin would understand them. I know that sounds very confusing, but he wanted the educated people to be able to understand him, not necessarily the other people. Okay, uh, so he saw his time period as separate from the Middle Ages as kind of a foray into a new time period and a new, well, just a new time period. I think I just talked myself into a corner. Based on the classics, this goes back to literary works of ancient Greece and Rome. He thought that anyone who was intellectual, that really wanted to be intelligent, needed to be solitary, so live alone, reject your family, community, kind of live by yourself, and dedicate your entire life to serving the state and making lives better for everyone. The humanities are poetry, philosophy, history. A lot of other things fall into that section. So I actually have a degree in the humanities, or actually, I have two in the humanities. Uh, Leonardo Bruni. Okay, he wrote what was called the New Cicero. Okay, and he wrote this in the vernacular where the common man could read it. And this was not a common thing to do because no one cared about the common man. But it's coming up on the time period where you can actually release books that people, if they're taught how to read, can read in their own language. He learned from Manuel Chrysoloras, and he wrote the Latin history of Florence. That's Bruni. Now, Lorenzo Valla, he also studied Greek and Latin, and there were a lot of people who studied both, and he tried to reestablish Latin over the vernacular. Okay, basically get everyone speaking Latin again. Thought that was an easier thing for everyone to learn the same language, and that was the language of the Roman Empire and the language of greatness. He showed the donation of Constantine, which gave the Pope authority over local bodies. This was a document that he had found or forgered. I'm not sure if he forgered it or if he found it, but eventually they'll find out that it was a forgery, and this was just a kind of power grab done by the Pope. Okay, so Renaissance education. If you're educated in this time, you have a focus on Latin and Greek, the liberal arts, grammar, music, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, rhetoric, and logic. Basically, what they're trying to do is make everyone into a well-rounded person. Uh, Now, Johann Gutenberg. Okay, uh, what he did was is pivotal to the creation of a modern society as the internet was recently. Okay, he invented the printing press with movable type, which means that you could make any document and make as many copies of it as you wanted. So no longer were you bound by monks who were, printing, one page at a time or one verse at a time. Now you could print the entire Bible. Several of these Bibles still do exist. In fact, if you go to Europe, you can go to. Uh, my wife and I went to the city. Let me think. What was that called? In the city of Mainz. Okay, it's a small city. They have a nice little Gutenberg museum there, and they actually have one of the copies of the Gutenberg Bible, and they have some of the old presses kind of set up where Actually, I don't think they're the original. I think they just made some that looked like the original. And anyway, this is a pivotal moment in world history whenever you can actually make mass copies of books. So knowledge will eventually be accessible by everyone. The fall of the Byzantine Empire. This happens in 1453. This was a continuation of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire would eventually be split under Constantine, where he had an eastern capital and a western capital, one in Rome and one in the outside of the Greek city of Byzantium. And then they renamed the city, Constantinople after Constantine, and then they named the empire the Byzantine Empire after the city of Byzantium in eastern Greece. Well, uh, what really caused the eventual downfall of the Byzantine Empire was whenever it was sacked in the Third Crusade. Uh, it really messed up the defenses of the city. Uh, the Ottoman Turks had taken control of northern Byzantine territory before this, and Constantinople fell to Sultan Mehmed II in 1453. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. Okay, Baldassare Castiglione. He wrote a book called The Book of the Courier. Now, this is what the opposing viewpoints is over, so I don't know. At the time I'm filming this, I should have looked at the syllabus beforehand. But basically, you have two different thoughts on how a noble should act. On the one hand, you have the Book of the Courier. Okay, this is how to get influence and favor from the rich and the powerful. That you should educate all of the men of the time classically in all of the major liberal arts and the humanities. Uh, but more than anything, you need to be have some skills in military arts, but culture is more important than anything. Being a balanced person, and to a certain degree, being more of a servant. So that's Castiglione in the Book of the Courier. Okay. Now Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. He wrote the Oration on the Dignity of Man, and this went through and combined several different philosophers, several different religions, and basically what his concept or conclusions were that man is divine or holy like a god and can achieve divinity. So we can really become a god with intellectual and spiritual regeneration. So basically, if you work hard enough, if you study enough, and you renew your spirit, you will eventually make yourself into a god. Hasn't worked for me. Lorenzo de' Medici, he ruled Florence during the Golden Age, the patron of intellectuals and arts. Now, most of the great artists of the time had some type of patron who paid for all their stuff so that they would be able to make the art that they were trying to make. Okay, so they played an important role in making it possible for artists to be artists. They paid for their work at the time. They weren't selling a lot of work, so you had to have some patron help fund you. Now let's look at Niccolo Machiavelli. Okay, he writes a book called the Prince. Okay, and he does a lot to push for pragmatism. Okay, someone more modern would be Otto von Bismarck, who kind of goes with the same idea of realpolitik, which is basically you have to be. Uh, Sorry, I don't remember the word. You have to be pragmatic. Okay, so don't be afraid to betray a promise. Don't be afraid to kill someone. Don't do all the things that you know. Don't be afraid to do the things that you have to do. Okay, Uh, so you don't have to apologize because you're in power. Self-interest is important for a ruler, but not necessarily the people. Okay, so uh, let's see what else. Act on act on the interests of the state. So a lot of people would disagree that you could do anything you could if you were in power. However, wealthy people now, I think, would probably agree with Machiavelli. Okay, Hermeticism. Okay, this focuses on the occult, on theological beliefs, philosophical beliefs. Uh, it's a new line of thinking. Again, this is a push away towards organized religion. Okay, uh, Marsilio Ficino translates Corpus Hermeticum. Okay, which, if you're interested, if you see a word that ends with um, it is singular. Okay. Uh, anyway, that's from one of my linguistics courses I took probably before most of you were born. Okay. Uh, so he studied Plato's work and he translated it into Latin as well. And he tried to reconcile Plato and Christianity by kind of explaining how Plato's beliefs and sayings worked hand in hand with Christianity and that you could believe in them both. Okay, individualism. Okay, this is a study on the potential of the individual. Okay, and during this time period, there's a whole push to a different side of power than had ever been there before. Before you're talking about just acquiring wealth and military, but here you're trying to control the environment around you. Okay, um, this is mastering cartography or mapping the globe. This is something that was first, well, it's recognized by most of Western Europe as done under Henry the Navigator of Portugal, but in reality, a lot of these things were done by Muslim sailors beforehand. Okay, sound or musical notation. You start to have the appearance of all types of musical instruments that make different types of sound. As far as painting, you're looking at abstract paints, abstract space, so three-dimensional perspective in painting. So before that, there's much less look at anything of the surroundings and just a focus on the main person in the painting. Double entry bookkeeping, which is still done today if you take accounting. That's one of the things that you'll learn. Uh, and a new birth of politics. Now, art of the time, okay? You have oil-based paints, okay? You have effects with light and shadow over a thin layer of paint. Now, I know a lot of these things are taught now, but before they exist, someone has to try and develop these type of skills. I mean, if you've gone online and looked on TikTok, on YouTube, or just about any type of video-based program, you'll see someone do sketches that are just amazing in a short period of time. If you're ever going through the streets of major cities, you might see an artist that's doing work right on the street and can create a work of art in just a matter of minutes. Perspective, okay, uh, optics and perspective geometry try and give a realistic view of the visual plane. This again is kind of the push towards three dimensions in painting. Naturalism, fascination of the human body, muscular tone and movement. Uh, it was not always okay to paint those type of things, but Michelangelo was really able to do it not just in paintings, but in his sculptures as well. Heroic humans and anatomic dissections. Again, you're not really allowed to do any type of autopsy or study of dead bodies until really into the 19th century. So somewhere in the 1850s, people found it okay to go ahead and look at bodies and see what they could learn from the dead to try and sustain the living. Order and symmetry is important in oil, marble, and stone art. Try and make everything look the same. Um, again, you'll see a push away from that here in the future. Okay, Donato di Donatello. This is one of the great artists of the time. He did David on the left-hand side of the screen. Uh, so there's a David that was done by Donatello and a David that was done by Michelangelo. This is one of the first bronze statues done since ancient times, and it's pretty detailed. It's pretty magnificent to see if you ever get a chance to see it in person. Okay. Uh, Masaccio, over on the right hand side of the screen, it's the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. Okay. The agony and the shame of the couple, you can see how much they're in pain, covering themselves because they didn't know they were naked. Uh, they didn't even understand what that meant until the realization hit them. Uh, the attempt at realism in the painting and the three-dimensional world. You can see him walking in front of her, and you can see the angel behind them in the distance. Now, perspective-wise, the angel probably should be a little bit smaller, but this is kind of a revolution in the way of doing art. This brings us to the end of yet another day, and for anyone who's really interested in art, you can look forward to the next lesson because we'll be talking about a lot of greats from Michelangelo to Leonardo da Vinci and several others that you may or may not have heard of. So in the meantime, everyone have a great day, and I'll see you soon.